It was a peaceful Saturday morning when I first noticed Deborah Patterson marching up my driveway, clipboard in hand and a scowl etched across her face. I had been expecting this visit for weeks. As the newly elected Whispering Pines HOA president, Deborah had been making her rounds through our suburban neighborhood, finding fault with everything from mailbox heights to the shade of beige on garage doors. I put down my coffee mug and stepped onto the porch. Behind me, Clementine the goat bleated softly from her pen in the side yard, almost as if she sensed the coming storm. "Good morning, Deborah," I called out, trying to sound cheerful. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Deborah didn't return my smile. Her eyes darted past me to where Clementine was now joined by Mabel, my miniature donkey. The animals were quietly munching on hay, completely oblivious to the brewing conflict. "Mr. Martinez," she began, her voice crisp and rehearsed, "I've received multiple complaints about your livestock situation." She practically spat out the word livestock like it was poison on her tongue. I fought the urge to roll my eyes. "Is that right? From whom exactly?" "That's confidential HOA business," she replied, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "The point is, Section 12, Paragraph 3 of our community bylaws clearly states that no livestock or farm animals are permitted within residential properties. Pets are limited to 2 dogs, 2 cats, or small caged animals kept indoors." I nodded patiently. I'd memorized the bylaws myself, for reasons Deborah couldn't possibly imagine. "These animals are creating odors, noises, and frankly, they're an eyesore," she continued, gaining steam. "Several neighbors have complained that their property values will plummet with a barnyard next door." As if on cue, Henry the pig snorted loudly from his custom-built enclosure. Deborah visibly cringed. "You have exactly 14 days to remove these nuisance animals," she declared, thrusting a yellow notice toward me. "After that, the HOA will begin assessing daily fines of $100 per animal." I took the paper without looking at it. "Deborah, I understand your concern, but these animals are well cared for. They're clean, they're quiet most of the time, and—" "It doesn't matter how well you care for them," she interrupted. "Rules are rules, Mr. Martinez. Without them, we'd have chaos. Next thing you know, someone will want chickens, then someone else will bring in alpacas, and suddenly our beautiful planned community looks like old MacDonald's farm." I couldn't help but chuckle at that, which only made Deborah's face twisted with indignation. "This is outrageous. I am the elected president." "All in favor of Mrs. Wilkins serving as meeting chair," Rebecca called out. Hands shot up throughout the room, an overwhelming majority. "The motion carries," Sarah announced. "Mrs. Wilkins, please take the chair." Eleanor, surprisingly spry for her age, made her way to the front of the room. Deborah reluctantly moved aside, whispering furiously with her attorney. "Thank you, neighbors," Eleanor began. "For 30 years, I've watched this community grow and change. I've seen 5 HOA presidents come and go. I've never witnessed a meeting with this level of attendance, which speaks to the seriousness of today's issues." She adjusted her glasses. "We're here to address specific concerns about the current HOA leadership. Mr. Martinez will present evidence first, followed by Dr. Wilson." As I walked to the front of the room with my laptop and documents, Deborah's attorney stood. "My client objects to these proceedings. This is a witch hunt based on personal vendettas and misinformation." "Your objection is noted," Eleanor replied calmly. "Mr. Martinez, please proceed." For the next 30 minutes, I methodically presented our evidence: the financial irregularities, the pattern of selective enforcement, the false complaints filed against me and other residents. I displayed photographs, financial records, and copies of violation notices that demonstrated clear bias. Eleanor's video of the 4:30 a.m. animal control raid drew gasps of outrage from homeowners who hadn't yet seen it. When I finished, the room was buzzing with angry conversation. Deborah sat stone-faced, occasionally whispering to her attorney. "Thank you, Mr. Martinez," Eleanor said. "Dr. Wilson, you indicated you wished to speak." Dr. Wilson rose from his seat at the back of the room. As he walked to the front, Deborah's expression changed from anger to alarm. "Richard, remember our discussion," she hissed as he passed the board table. Dr. Wilson ignored her. Standing before the assembled neighbors, he looked both nervous and relieved. "For 3 years, I've served on this HOA board. During that time, I've been complicit in actions I knew were wrong. Today, I want to set the record straight." Over the next 20 minutes, Dr. Wilson confirmed everything we had suspected and revealed much more. The financial self-dealing was even more extensive than our investigation had uncovered. Deborah had pressured board members to approve contracts for friends and family members, often at inflated rates. She had targeted specific homeowners for enforcement, particularly those who questioned her authority or whose properties she coveted for her allies. Most shocking was his revelation about the violation quota system Deborah had implemented. Board members and their appointed neighborhood monitors were expected to identify a minimum number of violations each month to maintain a steady stream of fines flowing into HOA coffers. The entire system became about control and money, Dr. Wilson concluded, his voice heavy with regret. Not about maintaining our community. I take responsibility for my part in this, and I'm prepared to resign immediately. The room erupted in a mixture of outrage and stunned silence. Deborah's attorney was frantically writing notes while the Prescotts looked shell-shocked. Eleanor called for order. "Mrs. Patterson, would you like to respond to these allegations?" Deborah stood, her composure cracking. "This is slander. Richard is bitter because I questioned his medical practice's advertising signs. Everything we've done was for the good of the community, to maintain property values and standards." "By fining the Millers for their daughter's wheelchair ramp," someone called out from the back. "By taking photographs of our homes at midnight," added another voice. "By trying to remove farm animals that bring joy to our children," Mrs. Gonzalez demanded. Deborah's attorney attempted to regain control. "My client has acted within the scope of her authority as board president." "Actually," Sarah Keaton interjected, "if Dr. Wilson's testimony is accurate, several federal and state laws regarding fraud, harassment, and abuse of authority have been violated, not to mention the HOA's own charter, which requires financial transactions to be arm's length and prohibits conflicts of interest." The meeting continued to unravel for Deborah as more residents stood to share their experiences. The Jensens described the heartbreak of dismantling their children's treehouse over a 6-inch height violation. The Millers recounted their battle to keep their daughter's medically necessary wheelchair ramp. Mrs. Gonzalez displayed before and after photos of her award-winning garden, now reduced to regulation-approved plantings. Finally, Eleanor called for order again. "I believe we've heard enough. According to our bylaws, homeowners may call for a vote of no confidence in the board at any properly constituted meeting. Do I hear such a motion?" "So moved," Mark called out. "Second," echoed a dozen voices. Deborah's attorney stood again. "My client demands this vote be conducted by secret ballot over a 30-day period, as specified in the Article 12, Section 3 allows for immediate voice votes in cases involving allegations of misconduct," Sarah countered, holding up a copy of the bylaws. "The court reporter will record the count." Eleanor nodded. "All those in favor of removing the current HOA board due to misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty, please say aye." A thunderous chorus of aye filled the room. Those opposed? Only Deborah, the Prescotts, and a handful of others responded with nay. "The motion carries overwhelmingly," Eleanor announced. "The current board is removed, effective immediately." Deborah shot to her feet. "This is illegal. I'll sue every one of you. I'll make sure none of your homes sell for half what you paid. I built this neighborhood." Her outburst only confirmed everything we had been fighting against. The naked aggression, the threats, the belief that she personally controlled the community's destiny. "Mrs. Patterson," Eleanor said softly but firmly, "you didn't build this neighborhood. We all did. Every family here contributed to making Whispering Pines a community. You merely took advantage of our trust." As the reality of her defeat sank in, Deborah's rage gave way to something else: fear. Without the shield of HOA authority, she was just another homeowner who had made powerful enemies through years of bullying. Her attorney tugged at her arm, urging her to leave before she made things worse. As Deborah gathered her things to go, I approached her. "For what it's worth, I never wanted this to become so adversarial. My animals will be returning to the main farm facility once renovations are complete, and I had hoped we could coexist peacefully until then." She looked at me with cold eyes. "You've destroyed everything I built." "No," I replied. "I simply helped the community reclaim what was rightfully theirs all along: their homes, their neighborhood, their right to live without fear of arbitrary enforcement." The rest of the meeting proceeded with remarkable efficiency. Temporary board members were elected to serve until a formal election could be held: Eleanor, Mark, Rebecca, and, to my surprise, myself. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors lingered, talking excitedly about the future. Plans were made for a community barbecue the following weekend. Mrs. Gonzalez announced she would be replanting her full garden immediately and invited children to help. The Jensens said their treehouse would be rebuilt, this time with community input to make it a gathering spot for neighborhood kids. In the days that followed, the changes in Whispering Pines were remarkable. Colorful flowers appeared in previously regulation-restricted gardens. Basketball hoops were installed on driveways. The Miller's wheelchair ramp was rebuilt with the help of neighbors, this time with beautiful planters flanking it. As for Deborah, she put her house on the market the following week. Rumor had it she was moving to a seniors-only community across town, one with an even stricter HOA. The county prosecutor opened an investigation into the financial irregularities Dr. Wilson had revealed, and Deborah's attorney was busy negotiating a settlement that would keep her out of court. 2 months later, the renovations at Little Hooves Petting Farm were finally complete. As I prepared to move the animals back to their permanent home, a parade of neighborhood children came to say goodbye to Clementine, Mabel, Henry, Sugar, and Spice. "Will we still get to see them?" asked a little girl who had become particularly attached to the baby goats. "Of course," I assured her. "In fact, Whispering Pines residents now have standing invitations to visit Little Hooves any time, and we'll be bringing the animals back for the neighborhood's first annual Community Day next month." The new HOA, under Eleanor's practical and compassionate leadership, had transformed. The overly restrictive bylaws were revised through an inclusive process that involved all residents. Enforcement shifted from punitive to collaborative, with neighbors helping each other maintain their properties through volunteer work days. Most importantly, a strict conflict of interest policy was implemented, ensuring that all HOA contracts were awarded through transparent bidding processes. As I watched Mabel, the donkey, being loaded into the transport trailer, Eleanor joined me on the front lawn. "I never thought I'd say this," she mused, "but we actually owe Deborah a debt of gratitude." I raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "If she hadn't been so outrageously tyrannical, we might have continued sleepwalking through life here, never realizing how much better our community could be." She patted my arm. "And if she hadn't targeted your animals, we might never have found the courage to stand up to her." I smiled, thinking about the strange chain of events that had led us here. Sometimes the most unexpected challenges lead to the greatest improvements. As the last animal was loaded and secured, I took a final look at my yard, now empty of the creatures that had inadvertently sparked a neighborhood revolution. The experience had changed me too. What began as a temporary solution for housing my animals during renovations had evolved into a deeper connection with my community. Surprisingly, I had decided to keep my house in Whispering Pines, even though the animals were returning to the farm. This neighborhood, with its newly discovered spirit of cooperation and community, felt like home now. As I prepared to follow the animal transport to Little Hooves, neighbors gathered on the sidewalk to wave goodbye, Children held hand-drawn pictures of the animals, and several adults had brought farewell treats: carrots for Mabel, apples for Clementine and her kids, and a special mud bath mixture for Henry. "Don't be a stranger," Mark called. "Board meetings are every first Tuesday." "I'll be there," I promised. "After all, someone has to make sure you don't let the power go to your heads." Everyone laughed, secure in the knowledge that Whispering Pines would never again fall under the shadow of a dictatorial HOA president. As I drove away, following the trailer carrying my beloved animals, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. Deborah Patterson had called my farm animals a nuisance, never knowing that I owned the petting zoo. But in the end, those very animals had been the catalyst for liberating an entire community from her iron grip. Sometimes, it seems, a few well-placed nuisances are exactly what a neighborhood needs to rediscover its heart and soul. The Endurn, a deeper shade of red. "This isn't funny, Mr. Martinez. This is about maintaining standards. You have 14 days. She turned sharply and began walking away, but I couldn't resist. "Deborah," I called after her, "have you ever visited the Little Hooves petting farm out on County Road 8? She stopped and turned, looking confused by the sudden change in topic. "My grandchildren go there sometimes." "What does that have to do with anything?" I smiled. "No reason. Just curious." As Deborah disappeared down the street, I looked down at the violation notice and shook my head. What she didn't know, what none of my neighbors knew, was that I wasn't just Alex Martinez, the new guy who moved in 6 months ago. I was also Alex Martinez, owner and operator of Little Hooves Petting Farm, a licensed educational facility that had been bringing joy to local families for the past decade. These animals weren't just pets. They were professional ambassadors taking a working sabbatical at my home while we renovated their main facility. And, thanks to state agricultural education exemptions, Deborah's precious HOA rules didn't have a leg to stand on. I tucked the notice into my pocket and walked over to Clementine, scratching behind her ears. "Well, girl," I murmured, "looks like we're about to give Miss Patterson a little lesson in reading the fine print." Little did Deborah know, she had just picked a fight she couldn't possibly win, and I had all the documentation to prove it. Section 2. Community Whispers and Secret Allies. The following day, I was in my front yard setting up a new enrichment area for the animals when my next-door neighbor, Eleanor Wilkins, peered over the fence. Eleanor was in her 70s with silver hair, always perfectly styled, and unlike most in the neighborhood, she seemed to enjoy the animals. "Trouble with the dragon, lady?" she asked, nodding toward my house where the yellow violation notice was now stuck to my refrigerator, visible through the kitchen window. I sighed, hammering a post into the ground. "Deborah doesn't appreciate my temporary residence." Eleanor snorted. "That woman doesn't appreciate anything that doesn't conform to her narrow view of perfection. Last month she sent me a warning because my bird feeder was non-conforming to neighborhood aesthetics. It's been hanging in the same spot for 12 years. I laughed, genuinely amused by Eleanor's indignation. "What did you do?" "Painted it beige to match my siding," she said with a wink. "But I filled it with extra colorful birdseed that attracts the most vocal blue jays in the county. They start singing right outside her bedroom window at 5 every morning." I put down my hammer and wiped sweat from my brow. "I don't think I can paint Clementine and Henry beige." "No, dear. But you might need allies. Deborah's been on a rampage since she took over from old Mr. Henderson. The Jensen family 2 streets over had to take down their children's treehouse because it was 6 inches taller than regulation. 6 inches. Those poor kids were devastated." This wasn't the first time I'd heard stories like this. In the 6 months since I'd moved in, I'd witnessed Deborah's growing campaign to enforce every minute detail of the HOA bylaws. Most residents simply complied rather than face the continuous harassment and escalating fines. "You know," Eleanor continued, lowering her voice despite the fact that we were alone, "there's a small group of us meeting tomorrow night at the Thompsons' house. Just neighbors who are tired of living under Deborah's thumb. You should come." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A resistance movement?" We prefer Community Preservation Society, Eleanor replied with a mischievous grin. 7 o'clock. Bring dessert. After Eleanor left, I continued working in the yard, my mind racing with possibilities. I hadn't planned on making waves in the neighborhood. The animals were only staying with me for another 3 months while the petting zoo underwent major renovations. I had all the proper permits and exemptions filed with the county. Legally, there was nothing Deborah could do. But these stories of neighbors being bullied troubled me deeply. Perhaps it was time to take a stand not just for myself, but for the entire community. That evening, I called my business partner and farm manager, Jasmine. "How's the renovation going?" I asked when she picked up. "Slow," Jasmine sighed. "The contractor found mold in the east barn wall. Could add another 4 weeks to the timeline." I groaned. "That's not good news. The HOA president here is on my case about the animals." "But we have all the exemptions," Jasmine said, confusion evident in her voice. "Your property is officially designated as a temporary extension of our agricultural education facility. They can't touch you." "I know that, and you know that. But Deborah Patterson is the type who doesn't care about legal technicalities until they're shoved in her face." "Want me to send over the paperwork again?" Jasmine offered. "No, I've got copies. But maybe scan the zoning approval from the county. The original has that impressive gold seal that might make an impression." After hanging up, I went to check on the animals. Mabel, the donkey, brayed softly as I approached, nuzzling my hand for the apple slices she knew I carried in my pocket. Henry, the pot-bellied pig, was already snoring in his shelter, while Clementine and her 2 kids, Sugar and Spice, curled up together on their fresh bedding. The enclosures were immaculate. I prided myself on keeping the animals in clean, odor-free conditions. Their pens were positioned at the furthest corner of my property, well away from any neighbors' homes. I'd invested in special fencing that was both secure and aesthetically pleasing, designed to blend with the neighborhood's overall look. In truth, most of my immediate neighbors seemed to enjoy the animals. Children would stop by after school to pet Clementine, and several elderly residents mentioned how the gentle sounds of farm life reminded them of their childhoods. Only Deborah and her small circle of supporters took issue with my menagerie, and unfortunately, she now wielded considerable power within the community. As night fell, I retreated to my office where I kept all my business documents. Opening my filing cabinet, I pulled out a thick folder labeled Zoning and Permits. Inside was every piece of documentation I'd need to fight Deborah's notice: state licenses for agricultural education, county permits allowing temporary housing of farm animals for educational purposes, health department approvals, and even a letter from the state's Department of Agriculture recognizing Little Hooves as an essential educational resource for schools. I spread the papers across my desk, formulating a strategy. I could simply present these documents to Deborah and end the matter quickly. But something told me that wouldn't solve the larger problem. From what I'd heard, Deborah's crusade against anything she deemed non-conforming was hurting the entire neighborhood. Tomorrow's meeting with the Community Preservation Society might offer a better solution, one that could help everyone, not just me and my animals. I closed the folder and looked at the framed photograph on my wall, a picture of me surrounded by laughing children at the grand opening of Little Hooves 5 years ago. This wasn't just a business for me. It was a mission to connect children with nature, to teach them about caring for animals and the environment. I wasn't about to let Deborah Patterson put an end to that, even temporarily. As I headed to bed that night, I heard a car slow down in front of my house. Peeking through the blinds, I saw Deborah's white SUV idling at the curb. She appeared to be taking pictures of my property with her phone. Documentation, I muttered to myself. 2 could play at that game. I grabbed my own phone and recorded her surveillance. This might come in handy later. What Deborah didn't realize was that she wasn't dealing with just another intimidated homeowner. She was taking on someone who had battled county bureaucracy, state regulators, and skeptical banks for years to build Little Hooves from the ground up. I smiled as her car finally pulled away. Deborah Patterson had no idea what she was in for. Section 3. The Secret Meeting and Shocking Revelations. The Thompson residence was a modest two-story colonial with impeccable landscaping, the kind Deborah Patterson would approve of. As I walked up the driveway with a homemade apple pie in hand, featuring apples from my farm, of course, I noticed several cars parked discreetly along the street. Clearly, I wasn't the only one who had accepted Eleanor's invitation. Mark Thompson, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a receding hairline, greeted me at the door. "You must be Alex," he said, extending his hand. "Eleanor's told us about you and your animal situation. Come on in." The living room was filled with about 15 neighbors, some of whom I recognized from casual waves and brief encounters since moving in. Eleanor was there, seated in an armchair by the fireplace. She waved me over. "Everyone," Mark announced, "this is Alex Martinez, our newest neighbor who's already experiencing Deborah's special brand of welcome." A chorus of sympathetic groans filled the room. "Let me guess," said a woman I recognized as the kindergarten teacher from the local elementary school. "She gave you the yellow notice of doom?" I nodded. 14 days to remove my nuisance animals or face daily fines. "Classic Deborah," muttered a gray-haired man in the corner. "I got the same notice for my koi pond last year. Had to fill it in after 20 years because it wasn't on the approved water feature list." For the next 30 minutes, I listened as neighbors shared their Deborah horror stories. The Millers had been forced to remove their daughter's wheelchair ramp because it didn't match the approved materials list, despite being medically necessary. The Jacksons had received daily fines for having basketball practice in their driveway after 6 p.m. Mrs. Gonzalez, a retired florist, had been ordered to remove half of her award-winning rose garden because it exceeded the maximum allowable floral diversity in the front yard. The stories were absurd, but the pain and frustration they caused were real. Many of these people had lived in Whispering Pines for decades, long before Deborah Patterson had moved in and begun her crusade to remake the neighborhood in her image. "What surprises me," I said during a lull in the conversation, "is that she's been able to get away with this. Don't HOA boards have multiple members?" Mark Thompson nodded grimly. "That's part of the problem. Deborah stacked the board with her friends, the Prescotts and Dr. Wilson. They're basically a rubber stamp for whatever she wants to do. And only about 30% of homeowners voted in the last election," added Mrs. Gonzalez. "Most people don't pay attention until they're facing fines." Eleanor leaned forward. "Which brings us to why we're all here. The annual HOA board election is coming up in 6 weeks. We need to get organized and vote in new leadership." I looked around the room, seeing determination in the faces of my neighbors. They weren't just angry, they were ready for change. "We need candidates," Mark continued. "People willing to challenge Deborah and her cronies. People who understand that an HOA should serve the community, not rule it with an iron fist." Several hands went up, including Eleanor's. "I'll run," she said firmly. "I've lived here for 30 years. People know me." "Me too," said Mrs. Gonzalez. "I'm tired of hiding my roses behind privacy screens." The kindergarten teacher, whose name I learned was Rebecca Collins, also volunteered. "I have connections with all the families with children in the neighborhood. That could help with votes." The meeting continued, with neighbors strategizing about voter outreach, campaign messaging, and how to counter Deborah's inevitable pushback. I listened, impressed by their organization and determination. Then Mark turned to me. "Alex, you're new here, but you already have a compelling story. Having someone who's actively fighting Deborah's overreach would be a powerful symbol." I hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm the right person. My situation with the animals is temporary, and I'm already planning to fight her on legal grounds." "That's exactly why you'd be perfect," Eleanor insisted. "You have knowledge and resources the rest of us don't. Plus, you clearly care about education and community. Look at what you do with that petting farm of yours." I was surprised. "You know about Little Hooves?" Eleanor smiled. "Of course, dear. I may be old, but I'm not out of touch. My grandchildren love that place. When I saw your animals, I recognized Clementine from their birthday visits. I didn't say anything because I figured you had your reasons for keeping it quiet." I looked around the room, seeing hopeful faces. These people had been suffering under Deborah's reign of terror for years. They'd welcomed me into their community, and now they were asking for my help. "All right," I said finally. "I'll join your slate of candidates, but you should all know something about me and my animals." I took a deep breath. "I'm not just keeping them as pets. I'm Alex Martinez, the owner of Little Hooves Petting Farm. These animals are temporarily living with me while our main facility undergoes renovations." A hush fell over the room, followed by excited murmurs. "The Educational Petting Zoo on County Road 8? Asked Mark, his eyes widening. "My kids had their birthday parties there last year." I nodded. "That's the one. What Deborah doesn't know is that I have full legal exemption from the HOA rules because my property is currently registered as a temporary extension of an agricultural education facility. I've got all the paperwork, permits, and zoning approvals." The room erupted in cheers and laughter. Eleanor clapped her hands in delight. "This is perfect," Rebecca exclaimed. "Deborah's going after someone who not only has the legal right to keep those animals but runs a beloved community institution. Not to mention," added Mrs. Gonzalez, "the educational value those animals provide. My grandchildren came home from your farm talking about sustainable agriculture for weeks." The mood in the room had shifted from determination to excitement. Suddenly, the possibility of defeating Deborah seemed much more real. "Here's what I propose," I said, feeling a surge of confidence. "I'll handle my own situation with the animals through legal channels. That's step one. But I also want to help with the broader campaign to reform the HOA." "How do you suggest we proceed?" Mark asked. "First, we need to understand exactly what powers the HOA actually has. I've dealt with enough regulatory bodies to know that many of them rely on intimidation more than actual authority. Let's review the official bylaws and the state laws governing HOAs." Eleanor nodded eagerly. "I have copies of all the original community documents from when my husband and I first moved here. The bylaws have been amended over the years, but I've kept every version." "Excellent," I said. "Second, we need to document everything. Every violation notice, every unreasonable demand, every instance of selective enforcement. We need dates, times, photographs, evidence that Deborah isn't just enforcing rules but abusing her power." The neighbors exchanged glances, and several people pulled out their phones, scrolling through photos they'd already taken of various HOA disputes. "Third," I continued, "we need to get more neighbors involved. 30% voter turnout isn't enough. We need to reach out to everyone, especially those who have been intimidated into silence." The meeting continued late into the night as we formulated a comprehensive strategy. By the time I left the Thompsons' house, we had formed committees, assigned tasks, and created a secure online group to share information. The Community Preservation Society had transformed into a full-fledged campaign for change. As I walked home under the starlit sky, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. What had started as a personal battle over my animals had evolved into something much more significant, a fight for the soul of this community. I had no idea that the following day would bring the conflict to a boiling point, much sooner than any of us had anticipated. Section 4. Escalation and Unexpected Allies. I awoke the next morning to frantic knocking at my front door. Bleary-eyed and still in my pajamas, I stumbled to answer it, finding Rebecca Collins on my doorstep, her face pale with urgency. "Alex, you need to come outside right now," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Deborah's here with someone from the county, and they're examining your animal enclosures." I quickly threw on some clothes and hurried out to my backyard. Sure enough, Deborah Patterson stood by the fence, her arms crossed triumphantly as she spoke to a man in a county uniform who was taking notes on a clipboard. "Mr. Martinez," Deborah called out as I approached. "This is Mr. Rollins from the County Health Department. I filed a formal complaint about your unauthorized livestock operation in a residential zone. The county official looked uncomfortable as he turned to me. Sir, we've received a complaint about possible violations of county health codes regarding the keeping of farm animals in a residential area. I took a deep breath, fighting to keep my expression neutral despite the anger bubbling inside me. I understand. May I ask what specific violations you're investigating? Mr. Rollins glanced at his clipboard. The complaint alleges improper waste management, potential disease vectors, and violation of residential zoning restrictions. I see, I replied calmly. And may I show you some documentation that might be relevant to your investigation? Deborah's smug smile faltered slightly. The HOA bylaws clearly prohibit farm animals, Mr. Martinez. County health codes aside, you're in violation of the community rules you agreed to when you purchased this property. I ignored her, focusing on the county official. Mr. Rollins, would you mind waiting here for just a moment while I retrieve some paperwork from my office? He nodded, and I hurried inside. By now, several neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, watching the confrontation unfold. Eleanor was among them, her face set in a concerned frown. I gave her a reassuring nod as I passed. In my office, I grabbed the thick folder of permits and licenses I had prepared. I also took a moment to call Jasmine at the farm. Deborah escalated things, I explained quickly. She brought a county health inspector to my house. I need you to email me those recent inspection reports from the Department of Agriculture just in case. On it, Jasmine replied. Want me to come over? Not yet, but stay by the phone. I returned to the backyard where Deborah was now pointing out various concerns to the increasingly uncomfortable-looking inspector. And the odor, Mr. Rollins. Surely you can smell it. It's affecting property values throughout the neighborhood. Mr. Rollins sniffed awkwardly. Actually, ma'am, I don't detect any significant odor. I approached them with my folder. Mr. Rollins, I believe these documents will clarify the situation. I handed him the entire folder. You'll find state agricultural education facility licenses, county permits specifically allowing these animals at this address as a temporary extension of Little Hooves Petting Farm, health inspection certificates for all animals, and waste management protocols approved by the Department of Agriculture. The inspector's eyebrows shot up as he began reviewing the documents. Little Hooves? The educational farm on County Road 8? Yes, that's my primary business, I confirmed. We're undergoing renovations at the main facility, so these animals are temporarily housed here, with all proper permits and exemptions, as you can see. Deborah's face had gone from smug to shocked to increasingly pale as she processed this information. That's not possible. This is a residential neighborhood. Mr. Rollins flipped through the permits, nodding. Everything appears to be in order, Mr. Martinez. These temporary housing permits are valid, and your waste management protocols exceed county requirements. He turned to Deborah. Ma'am, there's no health code violation here. The property has been granted a temporary agricultural education exemption recognized by both county and state authorities. But the HOA rules, Deborah sputtered. HOA rules cannot supersede state law, Ms. Patterson, I explained gently. The Agricultural Education Protection Act specifically exempts licensed facilities like mine from local restrictions, including HOA regulations. It's mentioned in the documentation I just showed Mr. Rollins. By now, the crowd of neighbors had grown, and murmurs rippled through them. I could see Eleanor explaining the situation to those nearby, pointing at my house and then toward County Road 8 where Little Hooves was located. Mr. Rollins closed the folder and handed it back to me. I'll need to file a report showing no violations found. In fact, he added, looking around the impeccably maintained enclosures, these are some of the cleanest animal habitations I've seen. You clearly take excellent care of these animals, Mr. Martinez. Thank you, I replied. They're not just livestock, they're educational ambassadors. We host school groups, teach children about animal care and sustainable farming practices. These animals are part of our community outreach program." Deborah stood frozen, her face a mixture of disbelief and fury. "This isn't over, Martinez," she finally hissed. "The HOA has other measures to address nuisances." "I'm sure we can discuss this civilly at the next board meeting," I replied. "In fact, I'd like to make a presentation about Little Hooves and the educational opportunities we offer to the community." Mr. Rollins thanked me for my time and left, nodding politely to the gathered neighbors as he walked to his county vehicle. Deborah remained standing by the fence, seemingly unable to process her very public defeat. Finally, she turned to the onlookers. "This is a private matter between the HOA and Mr. Martinez. Please return to your homes." No one moved. Instead, Mrs. Gonzalez stepped forward. "Deborah, we're tired of your bullying," she said firmly. "Alex has every right to have these animals here, just like I have every right to my rose garden, and the Millers have every right to their daughter's wheelchair ramp. And my children have the right to play basketball in our driveway," added a man I recognized as Mr. Jackson. One by one, neighbors voiced their frustrations with Deborah's reign of terror. The HOA president's face grew redder with each accusation until finally, she pushed through the crowd and stormed away, nearly tripping in her haste. As the neighbors dispersed, many stopped to congratulate me and to meet the animals properly. Children who had previously only watched from a distance now petted Clementine under their parents' supervision. Eleanor beamed at me from the sidelines. "That was quite a show," she said when the crowd had thinned. "Deborah's never been publicly humiliated like that before." "I didn't intend to humiliate her," I replied honestly. "I just wanted to protect my animals and my business." "Well, intentional or not, you've just become the neighborhood hero, and Deborah has made a powerful enemy." Eleanor's words proved prophetic. That evening, I received an email from Deborah, copying the entire HOA board. The yellow violation notice was officially rescinded, but the message contained a thinly veiled threat. "While your animals may be temporarily exempt from certain regulations, the HOA board will be closely monitoring your property for any other violations of community standards. Additionally, we will be reviewing our bylaws to address future situations involving businesses operating in residential areas." I forwarded the email to the Community Preservation Society group we had created the night before. Within minutes, responses flooded in, ranging from outrage to amusement at Deborah's transparent attempt to save face. Mark Thompson called me directly. "This is just the beginning," he warned. "Deborah doesn't take defeat well. She'll be looking for other ways to make your life difficult." "I know," I replied, "but we're ready for her now, and we have something she doesn't." "What's that?" "A community that's finally standing together." What I didn't know then was just how far Deborah would go in her quest for revenge, or that her next move would lead to discoveries far more damaging than any of us could have imagined. Section 5. Countermeasures and Discoveries. The next few days were surprisingly quiet. Too quiet. Anyone who knew Deborah Patterson would have found her silence suspicious, and I certainly did. I spent the time reinforcing my defenses, double-checking all permits, installing security cameras around my property, and continuing to document the impeccable condition of the animal enclosures. I also used this lull to learn more about the HOA's history and operations. Eleanor provided me with boxes of old documents, meeting minutes, financial statements, and correspondence going back years. Together with Mark and Rebecca, we spent evenings poring over these records, looking for patterns and inconsistencies. "Look at this," Rebecca said on our third night of research, spreading financial statements across my dining room table. The HOA's landscaping budget tripled 2 years ago, right after Deborah became president. Mark frowned, examining the numbers. "And the contractor is Evergreen Landscapes? I've never heard of them." I pulled out my laptop and did a quick search. "That's because they barely exist. They were incorporated 3 years ago and have exactly one client, this HOA. Eleanor peered over her reading glasses at the statements. Who authorized these increases? The board, unanimously, Rebecca replied, flipping through meeting minutes. Deborah, Dr. Wilson, and the Prescotts. Something doesn't add up, I muttered, digging deeper into public records online. Evergreen Landscapes is registered to... Interesting. Patricia Wilson. Any relation to our Dr. Wilson on the board? Mark's eyes widened. That's his wife. The four of us exchanged looks of growing understanding. Conflict of interest, Eleanor said quietly. They've been funneling HOA funds to a company owned by a board member's family. Keep digging, I urged. If there's one instance, there might be more. By midnight, we had uncovered a pattern of suspicious financial dealings. The security company that monitored the neighborhood gates, owned by James Prescott's brother, the administrative assistant who processed HOA paperwork, Deborah's niece, the independent property inspector who issued violation notices, Dr. Wilson's former medical partner. They've created a self-enriching ecosystem, Rebecca said, disgust evident in her voice, using our HOA fees to line their own pockets while terrorizing anyone who steps out of line. This explains why Deborah is so aggressive about enforcing rules and collecting fines, Mark added. More enforcement means more money flowing through the system, money they can direct to their own connections. I sat back, processing this information. We need to be careful with this. These are serious allegations. We need a lawyer, Eleanor stated firmly, someone who specializes in HOA law and possibly white-collar crime. I know just the person, I replied, the attorney who helped me navigate all the regulatory issues when I was setting up Little Hooves. She's a bulldog when it comes to fighting corruption. The next morning, I called Sarah Keaton, Esquire, and scheduled a meeting. She agreed to review our findings and advise us on next steps. But Deborah wasn't idle during this time. 5 days after our confrontation with the health inspector, I received another email, this time from the HOA's attorney, threatening legal action for creating a hostile environment and defaming the character of board members. The email specifically mentioned the secret meeting at the Thompsons' house and accused us of conspiracy to undermine the legitimate authority of the Homeowners Association. Somehow, Deborah had learned about our gathering. She's got an informant, Mark said when I called him about the email. Someone at the meeting must have reported back to her. Or she's bluffing, I suggested. Maybe she just saw people coming and going from your house and made an educated guess. Either way, the battle lines were now clearly drawn. Deborah was fighting to maintain her power and possibly cover up financial improprieties. We were fighting for a fair and transparent HOA that served the community rather than exploiting it. The day before our scheduled meeting with Sarah Keaton, I received an unexpected visitor. A sleek black SUV pulled into my driveway, and a tall, distinguished man in an expensive suit stepped out. I recognized him immediately as Dr. Wilson, Deborah's right-hand man on the HOA board. I met him at the door, curious but cautious. Dr. Wilson, this is a surprise. He glanced nervously over his shoulder before speaking. May I come in, Mr. Martinez? I'd prefer not to be seen. Intrigued, I invited him inside. Dr. Wilson declined my offer of coffee and got straight to the point. I know what you and your friends have been investigating, he said, his voice low, and I want you to know. I want out. I kept my expression neutral. Out of what, exactly? This whole mess, the HOA, the contracts, all of it. He ran a hand through his silver hair. It wasn't supposed to go this far. When Deborah first approached me about joining the board, she presented it as a way to serve the community. The business with Patricia's landscaping company was just supposed to be a small side benefit. But it grew into something more, I prompted when he paused. Dr. Wilson nodded miserably. Deborah became obsessed with control. Every aspect of the neighborhood had to conform to her vision. And the financial arrangements, they kept expanding. I tried to object when she wanted to hire James's brother's security firm at twice the rate of our previous provider, but she threatened to expose Patricia's company. Blackmail? Essentially. Once you're in Deborah's web, it's nearly impossible to escape. She has something on everyone. I studied the man before me. He seemed genuinely distressed, but I couldn't help wondering if this visit was some sort of trap. Why are you telling me this? Dr. Wilson met my eyes. Because what you did with those animals, standing up to her with actual legal backing, it was the first time I've seen anyone beat Deborah at her own game, and now I hear you're gathering evidence about the financial irregularities. We're merely reviewing public documents, I said carefully. Well, those public documents don't tell the whole story. He reached into his suit jacket and withdrew a USB drive. This contains emails, meeting recordings, and private financial records that never made it into the official minutes, including discussions about how to target specific homeowners for violations to either drive them out or force them to pay substantial fines. I stared at the small device he placed on my coffee table. Why would you give me this? Because I'm a doctor, Mr. Martinez. I took an oath to do no harm. What Deborah's been doing to this community, what she's made me complicit in, it's harmful. It's wrong, and I want it to stop. You realize this could have serious consequences for you as well? He nodded grimly. I'm aware. I've already spoken to my own attorney about potential immunity in exchange for cooperation, but I wanted you to have this information before your meeting with Sarah Keaton tomorrow. I was shocked. How did you know about that? A sad smile crossed Dr. Wilson's face. Like I said, Deborah has eyes and ears everywhere. Nothing happens in this neighborhood without her finding out eventually. He stood to leave. Use the information wisely, Mr. Martinez, and be careful. Deborah is more dangerous than you know. After Dr. Wilson left, I immediately called Mark, Rebecca, and Eleanor to tell them about this unexpected development. We agreed to meet at Sarah Keaton's office the following day, bringing both our own research and Dr. Wilson's USB drive. That night, as I checked on the animals before bed, I caught sight of the movement near my back fence. Peering through the darkness, I spotted a figure quickly retreating toward the street. I couldn't identify who it was, but the message was clear. We were being watched. I double-checked all my security cameras and made sure every door and window was locked before finally trying to sleep. Tomorrow would be a decisive day in our battle against Deborah Patterson and her corrupt HOA regime. I needed to be ready. What I didn't expect was that Deborah would make her most dramatic move yet before the sun even rose. Section 6. The Midnight Raid and Public Showdown. The sound of engines and raised voices jolted me awake at 4:30 a.m. Disoriented, I stumbled to my bedroom window and pulled back the curtain to see flashing lights in my driveway. 3 vehicles were parked outside: Deborah's white SUV, a police cruiser, and a large animal control van. My heart raced as I hurried to throw on clothes. By the time I made it downstairs, there was pounding at my front door. "Mr. Martinez," called a male voice, "County Animal Control. We have a warrant to inspect the premises and remove unauthorized livestock." I yanked open the door to find a uniformed animal control officer flanked by a police officer and, behind them both, Deborah Patterson, wearing a triumphant smile despite the early hour. "What is going on?" I demanded, directing my question to the officers rather than Deborah. The animal control officer, a young man who looked uncomfortable with the situation, held out a document. We received an emergency complaint about potentially dangerous exotic animals being kept in unsafe conditions, posing an immediate threat to the neighborhood. "Dangerous exotic animals?" I repeated incredulously. "I have a miniature donkey, a pot-bellied pig, and 3 dwarf goats." The complaint specified potential disease vectors and aggressive behavior. The officer continued, glancing at his paperwork. "This is absurd," I said, taking the warrant and scanning it quickly. "These animals are part of a licensed educational facility. I have all the proper permits and exemptions." "That's what we need to verify, sir," the police officer interjected. "The warrant allows us to inspect the animals and their living conditions." I noticed Deborah smirking behind them. "Fine," I said, stepping aside. "Come in, I'll show you my paperwork and the animals." As they entered, I pointed to Deborah. "She stays outside. This is my private property, and she has no official capacity here." Deborah's smile faltered. "I'm the HOA president. I filed the complaint." The police officer nodded in agreement with me. "Ma'am, you can wait outside. This is an official inspection, not a neighborhood tour." Deborah opened her mouth to protest but then closed it, stepping back onto the porch with a scowl. I led the officers through my house to the backyard where the animals were housed. The animals, disturbed by the commotion, were awake but calm. Clementine bleated softly when she saw me, while Henry the pig continued snoring in his clean enclosure. Mabel the donkey watched curiously from her stall. "These are the dangerous exotic animals?" the animal control officer asked, eyebrows raised. I nodded. "Terrifying, aren't they? Especially when they're sleeping." The officer suppressed a smile. "I need to check their conditions and your paperwork, sir." I retrieved my folder of documents while the officers inspected the enclosures. They measured the spaces, examined the food and water provisions, and checked the cleanliness of each area. "Everything seems to be in excellent condition," the animal control officer admitted. "These animals are very well cared for." I handed him the folder. "Here are all my permits, licenses, and exemptions. As you'll see, I own Little Hooves Petting Farm. These animals are temporarily housed here during renovations at our main facility. We're fully licensed as an agricultural education center, which exempts us from HOA restrictions under state law." Both officers reviewed the documents carefully. The police officer raised an eyebrow. "Little Hooves? My kids love that place. We had my daughter's birthday party there last year." "Glad to hear it," I replied with a smile. "That's exactly why these animals are here. They're educational ambassadors, not random livestock." After examining the paperwork, the animal control officer shook his head. "Sir, I apologize for the early morning disturbance. Your permits are all in order, and these animals are clearly not dangerous or exotic. The complaint was misleading." "Deliberately misleading," I corrected. "Ms. Patterson is well aware of my permits and exemptions. This is harassment, pure and simple." The police officer looked troubled. "Filing a false report is a serious matter." "I'd like to speak with your supervisor," I told the animal control officer. "I want to file a formal complaint about this incident. Being woken at 4:30 a.m. for an emergency inspection based on fabricated concerns is unacceptable." By now, lights were coming on in neighboring houses. People in bathrobes and pajamas began gathering on the sidewalk, watching the scene unfold. Eleanor stood at the edge of my property, phone in hand, clearly recording everything. When we returned to the front of the house, Deborah was pacing impatiently by the vehicles. "Well," she demanded, "are you removing those filthy creatures?" The animal control officer squared his shoulders. "No, ma'am. Mr. Martinez has all the proper permits and exemptions. The animals are in excellent condition and pose no threat whatsoever to the neighborhood." Deborah's face contorted with rage. "That's impossible. He's violating HOA regulations." "Ma'am," the police officer interjected, "state law supersedes HOA regulations in this case. Mr. Martinez's property is legally designated as a temporary extension of an agricultural education facility." "Furthermore," I added, loud enough for the gathering neighbors to hear, "this is the second time you've filed false complaints about my animals. First with the county health department, now with animal control. This constitutes harassment, and I'm prepared to take legal action." Deborah's eyes darted to the growing crowd. Neighbors were whispering and pointing, many capturing the confrontation on their phones. Her carefully cultivated image of authority was crumbling before everyone's eyes. "This isn't over, Martinez," she hissed, then turned to the officers. "I want your badge numbers. The HOA board will be filing formal complaints about your failure to enforce county regulations." The animal control officer sighed. "Ma'am, I've enforced the regulations exactly as written. The problem isn't with enforcement, it's with your understanding of the law." This struck a nerve. Deborah's face flushed a deep crimson as she stormed to her SUV, slammed the door, and peeled out of my driveway, nearly hitting Eleanor's mailbox in the process. The officers apologized once more before leaving. As their vehicles disappeared down the street, neighbors converged on my front yard, buzzing with questions and expressions of support. "Did she really call animal control on you?" asked Mrs. Gonzalez indignantly. "At 4:30 in the morning?" added another neighbor. "That's beyond ridiculous." Eleanor pushed through the crowd to my side. "I got it all on video," she said triumphantly, waving her phone. "Every last second, from the moment those vehicles pulled up." Mark and Rebecca arrived, hastily dressed but fully alert. "We saw the commotion from our windows," Mark explained. "Is everything okay?" I nodded, still processing the bizarre early morning raid. "The animals are fine. My permits are valid. But Deborah crossed a line today." "She's desperate," Rebecca observed. "She knows we're meeting with the lawyer later. This was a last-ditch effort to discredit you." "And it backfired spectacularly," Eleanor added with obvious satisfaction. As the neighbors continued discussing the morning's events, I noticed something unusual. People who had previously kept their distance, who had complied silently with Deborah's reign of terror, were now openly expressing their frustration. The spell of fear had been broken. By the time I finally shooed everyone away and went back inside, it was nearly 7 a.m. Too wired to sleep, I made coffee and called Sarah Keaton to update her on the latest development. "This actually strengthens our case," she said after I explained what had happened. "Filing false reports with county agencies shows a pattern of abuse of power. Bring the animal control paperwork with you to our meeting today." When I hung up, I noticed dozens of notifications on my phone. The neighborhood social media group was buzzing with activity. Someone had posted Eleanor's video of the confrontation, and it was spreading rapidly, accompanied by outraged comments from residents throughout Whispering Pines. Deborah's midnight raid had accomplished exactly the opposite of what she'd intended. Rather than intimidating me into compliance, she had galvanized the entire community against her. By the time I arrived at Sarah Keaton's downtown office at 2 p.m., accompanied by Mark, Rebecca, and Eleanor, the video had been viewed by nearly everyone in the neighborhood. People were now openly sharing their own stories of Deborah's overreach. Sarah Keaton, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with an impressive array of legal credentials displayed on her office wall, reviewed our evidence methodically. The financial irregularities, Doctor, Wilson's USB drive, Eleanor's video of the morning's confrontation, and all the documentation of previous HOA abuses. "This is quite the case," she said finally, leaning back in her chair. "What you've uncovered here goes beyond typical HOA overreach. The financial self-dealing alone could constitute fraud and breach of fiduciary duty." "What are our options?" Mark asked. Sarah considered for a moment. "You have several. First, you could pursue individual remedies. Mr. Martinez could sue for harassment, others could challenge specific violation notices, and so on. But that's a piecemeal approach." "We want systemic change," Eleanor insisted. "The whole HOA needs reformation." "Then your best option is to call for an emergency meeting of all homeowners," Sarah advised. "Present your evidence, call for a vote of no confidence in the current board, and elect new leadership." "Can we do that?" Rebecca asked. "The bylaws only require annual meetings." Sarah smiled. "Section 8, Paragraph 4 of your HOA charter allows for emergency meetings when called for by 20% of homeowners. Given the response to this morning's events, I don't think you'll have trouble getting those signatures." We left Sarah's office with a clear plan. She would prepare the legal notifications while we gathered signatures for the emergency meeting. The date was set for the following Saturday, just 10 days away. As we parted in the parking lot, I felt a mixture of determination and apprehension. "Deborah won't go down without a fight," I warned the others. She's already shown she's willing to go to extreme lengths. Let her try, Eleanor said firmly. We have the truth on our side, and now we have the community too. I returned home to find a certified letter in my mailbox, another HOA violation notice, this time for unauthorized commercial activity in a residential zone, and excessive visitor traffic. Deborah was shifting tactics, but her goal remained the same: to force me and my animals out of Whispering Pines. I added the notice to my growing file of evidence and went to check on the animals. They remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. Clementine nuzzled my hand, looking for treats, while Mabel brayed softly in greeting. Just a little longer, guys, I told them. Soon you'll be back at the farm where you belong, and this neighborhood will be a better place for everyone. What I didn't know then was that Deborah Patterson had one final desperate move to make, one that would change Whispering Pines forever. Section 7. The Emergency Meeting and Shocking Revelations. The 10 days leading up to the emergency meeting flew by in a blur of activity. Our petition for an emergency meeting gathered signatures from over 60% of homeowners, far more than the required 20%. Neighbors who had previously kept their heads down now openly supported our cause. Deborah and her allies weren't idle during this time. They sent out a flurry of official-looking notices warning of radical elements seeking to destabilize the community and outside agitators with personal agendas. They also began selectively enforcing bylaws against known supporters of our movement, suddenly discovering violations that had supposedly existed for years. The breaking point came 3 days before the scheduled meeting when Deborah attempted to have my animals removed again, this time claiming they violated county noise ordinances. The county official who responded was the same Mr. Rollins who had visited weeks earlier. He declined to issue any citations, instead noting in his official report that the noise levels from my property were well below regulatory thresholds and consistent with normal residential activity. By the time Saturday arrived, tension in the neighborhood had reached a fever pitch. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. at the community center, a neutral location that could accommodate all homeowners. Sarah Keaton would be present as our legal counsel, and we had arranged for a court reporter to create an official transcript of the proceedings. I arrived early with Mark, Rebecca, and Eleanor to set up. We had prepared a detailed presentation with photos, financial records, and testimonials from affected residents. Dr. Wilson had agreed to speak publicly about the financial improprieties, a crucial turning point in our campaign. As homeowners began filing in, I was struck by the attendance. Nearly every household was represented, unprecedented in the history of Whispering Pines HOA meetings, which typically drew only a handful of residents. At precisely 2 p.m., Deborah arrived with the Prescotts and her personal attorney, a stern-looking man in an expensive suit. She appeared confident, even smug, as she took her place at the board table at the front of the room. "This meeting is unauthorized," she declared immediately. "The HOA bylaws specify—" "Section 8, Paragraph 4, Sarah Keaton interrupted, rising from her seat beside me. "Emergency meetings may be called with signatures from 20% of homeowners. We have signatures from 63%. Deborah's attorney whispered something in her ear, and she frowned. "Very well. As board president, I call this meeting to order. The first item on the agenda—" "Point of order," Mark called out. "The purpose of this emergency meeting is to address allegations of misconduct by the current board. As such, a neutral moderator should preside. I move that Mrs. Eleanor Wilkins, our longest-standing resident, serve as temporary meeting chair." A chorus of "second" erupted from around the room.